In 1968, at the height of students' protests, a seminar held by philosophy professor T.W. Adorno was disturbed by students shouting and ultimately ended in 3 women walking up to him and exposing their chest. Adorno had become considered a part of a fascist elite that was hell-bent on covering up Germany's crimes and ensuring old structures would prevail. Habermas, a colleague of Adorno's, would later call this incident an example for left-wing fascism. While Habermas later regretted and retracted that statement, the choice in words, even in the heat of the moment, shows a great political schism between spiriting left-wing thinkers and young left-wing activists. You might say these old men were cancelled. What caused the students to react in such a way in a response to a person who had actually been quite supportive of their movement and their causes? This is one of the first and most prominent instances where young leftists attacked and vilified an older member or another member of their own whom they had identified as reactionary and as such hindering the cause. It was compared to the in-group fighting between social democrats and communists, but due to the relative recentness and the more accessible media at the time, this instance was more widely discussed, and because of that, is a bit easier to analyze. Today, the phenomenon is often discussed in relation to content creators and Twitter, but we had a number-cursed website before Twitter. Tumblr. I'm not sure why, but I very rarely see discussions about what Tumblr was like between 2014 and 2017 or 18. Even when things are discussed like the alt-right pipeline, which relates to Tumblr, at least in my opinion, some things, some conflicts that came to light during that time within the left tend to go undiscussed. So let's crack open that brain and bring out all of these repressed memories. Because, as Strange Ian said, Twitter is just like what Tumblr used to be. Before everyone started using the word cancelling to the point of borderline absurdity, the pretty much same phenomenon was known as call-out culture. This usually featured some or several users making call-out posts about other users whose behavior they thought was inappropriate, offensive, or otherwise problematic. The fandoms that were especially prominent for that kind of behavior were the Undertale and the Steven Universe fandom. Partially, of course, due to their size and also the relative recentness to the time period, but also because of 2 pretty famous incidents. In 2015, a Steven Universe fan published a fan art depicting the character Rose. The way the character was depicted was by many considered to be slimming them down, and as such, a fatphobic portrayal of the character. Over the next couple of days, a lot of harassment and bullying ensued to the point where the 19-year-old artist announced that they would take their own life. Luckily, this did not come to pass, and the person in question seems to be doing a lot better now. So, in 2017, an Undertale fan artist was at a convention. At said convention, what was presumed to be a fan of them handed them handmade cookies. The artist ate the cookies and had to discover that there were needles in them. They later uploaded photos of the incident on social media where the residue was seen. A chewed cookie, and a needle bloodstained. The incident and the cause for the incident was also discussed on English social media. And the English side became pretty convinced or pretty sure that the reason for that attack was their problematic fan art of Sans X Frisk. The reason why they suspected that was because other artists had also been harassed and sometimes banned through mass reporting for the same ship. I'm not aware of what became of that artist or the motives of the perpetrator because I kind of lost sight of the incident after it had happened. But it's just such a horrific example of community infighting that I wanted to include it. Now, to me, it's fucking whack to hurt real life people over not real people. But I do think that's true for everyone, at least on an essential level. So, what could cause someone to think that that behavior was acceptable or necessary? Well, I think antis, as they're often called in fandom spaces, are convinced that problematic fiction or problematic content results directly in real life harm to the people or group of people who are depicted in a problematic way. So, with the Undertale example, I think the perpetrator was probably convinced that depicting Sans and Frisk in such a way would result directly in societal acceptance of the abuse of minors. If and how fiction affects reality is greatly contested and discussed among psychologists, and honestly, I don't really want to get into it because psychology is fucking boring. Instead, let's look at how it's possible that a great number of people think that such a behavior is acceptable or necessary. Enter the moral panic. The term moral panic was coined by sociologist Stanley Cohen in the 70s. He defines it as a condition, episode, person or group of persons emerges to become defined as a threat to social values and interests. Its nature is presented in a stylized and stereotypical fashion by the mass media. Goode then adds to that, in a moral panic, a group or category engages or is said to engage in unacceptable, immoral behavior, presumably causes or is responsible for serious harmful consequences, and is therefore seen as a threat to the well-being, basic values, and interests of the society or sectors of the society. These perpetrators or supposed perpetrators come to be regarded as the enemy or an enemy of society. Folk devils, deviants, outsiders, the other. Legitimate and deserving targets of self-righteous anger, hostility, and punishment. Importantly, not any outrage qualifies as a moral panic. Outrage is quite an important aspect to regulating, building, and upholding a community. It is important to be outraged when there's an ethnic cleansing. What makes something a moral panic is the society-wide scale, the distortion of what actually happened, and the disproportional response. So going back to the rose example, let's look at how the narrative became distorted. I think that usually happens through a couple of steps until you arrive at the final point. Slimming down a character as fatphobic was applied and became this drawing as fatphobic. Then from there, the narrative became that the artist is fatphobic because why else would they make a fatphobic drawing? Now, if you're late to the party, the artist is fatphobic is the only thing you'll witness of the incident. You'll have to take the additional step of caring and actually looking into what has happened instead of just this interpretation of the events. I think this is how the construction of what Cohen labeled the folk devil begins. However, in this instance, it's absolutely crucial that all these claims are still understandable and have basis in reality. They do follow a logical framework which is just presupposed and omitted, which is, something we do every day when we speak. If you believe that slimming down a character in a fan art erases fat people, then that depiction of the character is fatphobic. If you believe that every action is the result of intent and not sometimes a mishap or a mistake, then the artist has to be fatphobic to make a fatphobic drawing. As such, this isn't really a panic. There's an irrational element to a panic which doesn't really apply here. It is also worth noting that there is considerable overlap between antis and king-critical people, at least generally speaking. Now, king-critical means that some kings are not only seen as mildly problematic, but as oppressive even. The most common target, I think, is BDSM. And in that case, the argument usually goes something along the lines of that BDSM simulates abuse, and you can consent to abuse. It features the same actions as abuse, so it is abuse, I think, is the idea behind that. And you can consent to being abused in the same way you can consent to becoming a slave or being killed. Now, if king critical sounds a little suspicious to you, you're not wrong. Most of the king critical people I've had to encounter were also gender critical. And the reason for that is that they share the same roots, second wave feminism, and have a very similar essentialistic view of womanhood. So this is why I believe that antis are an artifact of the 80s porn wars. And this is how Goode describes the conflict. Lurid, titillating, shocking, offensive, disgusting, degrading, immoral, oppressive, violent. Some observers have used these and even stronger adjectives to describe pornography. And most definitions are not only negative, they are essentialistic. They spell out an abstract quality that presumably pornography possesses. Such a definition refers to a specific, objective quality that dwells within its core, its very essence or inner being. It is what it is. There is no room for disagreement. Beginning in the mid-1970s, a wing of feminism launched a crusade against pornography. In their view, porn viewed women as sexual commodities rather than as sexual subjects in their own right. In spite of the seeming furor over pornography, however, in most respects, the feminist anti-pornography crusade was, at best, a marginal instance of a moral panic. As a movement, it attracted neither mass support nor enormous media attention. However, importantly, to anti-pornography feminists, pornographers represented a folk devil, an evil force that oppresses, brutalizes, and subjugates women. To the sociologist, there's no surprise when members of the society denounce a particular form of behavior as deviance. But the pornography uproar produced denunciations by feminists of feminists. And these denunciations involved charges that feminists who in fact opposed pornography were actually supporting it. The problem is, if we were to attempt to assess whether the feminist anti-porn uproar over porn was disproportional to the harm such material presumably caused, we'd run into a roadblock. The porn is violence assertion is not empirically testable, since the harm asserted is not objectively measurable. As such, the porn wars differ from genuine moral panics because they were contained to an extremely small subset of people, and within that, an even smaller subset of people. Crucially, what they do have in common with a moral panic is the construction of the devil, which also points us to a core difficulty of cancel culture or Twitter shenanigans in general. What is asserted is not empirically testable. Denial had no effect. It only inflamed my accusers. It was a well-known fact that I was queer, that I had done such and such. To assert otherwise offended common decency. Why, you could tell just by looking at me that I was not right. Nor could reason prevail. If I were going to be gay, would I do it at school? In a place likely to be discovered? Well, that's not our problem. You did it. Othering and the trope of the devil are not the same, but usually heavily intertwined. In many ways, being the other is the prerequisite to becoming the devil. It's hard to describe, let alone analyze, but based on my experience, I get the feeling that being the other means that common morality no longer applies to you. People, very often strangers, have told me that I look like a monster, thrown food at me, hit me, made fun of my injuries, or asked me about my genitalia and sexuality while I was waiting for the bus. I think anyone would agree that any of these behaviors are completely unacceptable. And yet, once you are identified as the other, they are fine to do to you. Common morality no longer applies to you, which essentially makes you a non-person. But how do you become the devil? I think it's actually quite easy, but it is a creeping development. What would be a normal slight if you were a person becomes a deadly sin if you are the other. You always have to be better, know better, look better, and do better just to be let alone. And even then, it is often not enough. People will still come after you. People will still treat you as a non-person. Things are, of course, slightly different in majority society. Subcultures always have their own morals, societal strata, and rules. I've been called bi and transphobic in the past, which, sure. But I'm not here to talk about how poor little me was called the poo-poo word on the internet. So let's just say that these accusations were completely true. Let's say that I did or said something that was bi or transphobic. What does such an accusation result in? Transphobia, biphobia, and so on are bad because things we consider to fall under these categories tend to result in real-life harm to these people. The problem I see here is that I am equated to an enemy for the sake of an ambiguous collective, in this case trans people, which I am now somehow no longer a part of because of what I did or said, meaning I am now no longer entitled to the cultural and political protection awarded to these groups by the accusers. Trans people becomes a nebulous and abstract collective without actual non-abstract people in it, without individuals. My integrity and agency as a person are questioned because I somehow defied that collective that doesn't even really exist. To me, this is too reminiscent of being one of the good ones, so I'm already not a fan. The bad ones, or deviants, then become symbols for why these groups are still marginalized. Man, if only ContraPoints wouldn't have said that being asked for her pronouns makes her slightly uncomfortable, but she's totally in favor of it for the sake of other trans people, then we wouldn't still struggle. The deviant in these circumstances is easy to defeat because they are vulnerable as they are part of the marginalized group. Defeating them grants momentary satisfaction of victory, while tearing down oppressive structures is not only a monumental task, but one that often seems to be on the brink of impossibility. The left deviant becomes a scapegoat for the political frustration of their peers. Zami, for example, identified as a person of color, yet they were met with escalating vitriol and aggression. It turns into this weird group dynamic where not only what the person really did or said becomes distorted, but what the community stands for or the rules it wants to uphold are heavily infringed upon by the community itself in order to reinforce the rule. And reinforcing the rule is, of course, a way of constructing identity. In order to establish and or reinforce the rule not to be racist or fatphobic, a person who likely frequently faces racism themselves becomes exiled in order to construct identity. Shit. The mechanisms are quite similar to societal folk devils. If you are othered within these circles, their normal rules also no longer apply to you. Violent actions against you become acceptable, and if you slight them in whatever way, violent actions against you become a necessity, an obligation even. In order to protect decency and the community, the devil must be overcome, must disappear. The key difference is the relation to majority society. Being the devil for an oppressed group means being seen as a collaborator to oppression, willingly or unwillingly. At the same time, you are still the normal folk devil for majority society, as your very existence threatens women, morality, children, whatever needs a good, strong man to protect it. You are not only rejected from the group you are forced to be a part of, general society, but also the group you feel a need to belong to. You become the devil in the truest sense, as you become the reason for everything bad. Fuck you, J.K. Rowling. I'm the brain damaged biological female you always feared. Sorry. In consequence, you are stripped of an important part of agency, no matter which group you choose to put above the other. In both cases, your ability to perceive the world and act well are questioned and maybe even denied. To both groups, you are either just a bad person that wants to cause harm, or you were manipulated or brainwashed into doing what you're doing. This furthers your status as a non-person. Allow me to give an example, in the hopes of my brain suit becoming more tangible. And of course, philosophers always with the example. And anyway, I read this off because otherwise, I'll make a mistake for sure. Okay. Here, maybe here, somewhere around here, we have an argument about the ban on work of people under 21 in strip clubs. I think that was a bill passed in Texas, maybe. Fact check me, editor me. Blue makes a good point about how 18-year-olds can still be impressionable, essentially questioning their ability to consent. Pink makes the equally good point that the same can be true at 21, sometimes because of late development or disability, things like that. What Blue does then, however, is insinuating that the only reason Pink is arguing in the first place is because Pink is a predator. With that accusation, the discussion is not only diverted from the initial point, but the integrity of Pink questioned, essentially denying their ability to have a valid point that should be considered. It nips any criticism regarding Blue's statement right in the bud, as anyone who criticizes them must be a man whose only goal is to prey on people. Interestingly, both sides do fear a slippery slope event happening. Blue fears a slippery slope into legalizing exploitation and preying, I guess, while pink fears a slippery slope into criminalizing sex work altogether. Neither fear or expectation can be proven or disproven, so blue reverts to demonizing pink to come out on top regardless. In this case, the construction of pink as the devil defends blue's view and also manufactures disagreement as impossible if you're under predator. I hope reading it off the script was alright, but if I don't, I fuck up because I don't remember Twitter beef well enough to fucking improv that shit. In order for the trans community or any other community to exist, those who do being trans wrong have to be excluded and punished, so that the community can build its collective identity and can be more than an aggregate of people. Generally speaking, not identifying or affiliating with a group is a privilege. Those who are deemed the standard or normal, of course, won't feel a strong need to associate with other white or straight people because their political interests are considered the baseline, the status quo, the normal. The baseline equation is no individuality within a group, no political power outside of the group. Balancing the individuality of every member while still unifying them behind a shared cause is an art that's not usually mastered. I don't think it's impossible, but don't wait for it. So even though I have no intrinsic motivation to strongly affiliate with any group, I still claim a place in them for political purposes. I have to. By recognizing, accepting, and transforming how the standard perceives you as the other, you claim the place you've been exiled to as your own, which gives you the power to alter it to your needs. This is what I consider to be the act of emancipation. Whether the standard is majority society or some other group doesn't really change that, I think. I think it doesn't really matter in that case. It's about schooling yourself and constant fluctuous becoming, about finding your individual and unique place in this bitch of a world. Lastly, I also reject the rhetoric of representing the community well. Who the fuck chooses who represents the community? I didn't vote for them. They happen to gain some recognition by majority society, and majority society forces them to represent the community because in our current system, the masses are not able to participate. I don't understand why this act of dehumanization is often leaned into and sometimes even embraced. Why the fuck are we demanding them to be good ones in our sense and image instead of fighting that dehumanizing act of seeing us as essentially a hive mind like group instead of individuals and human beings with agency? Does liberation and emancipation not mean to not project that everybody else is the same as you? To recognize that every person is different so that you truly stand as equals? Is that not what the struggle is about? The remaining question is, of course, why? Why does that happen? Well, the consensus I came across in the material I read is that it's all about cultural politics. Establishing boundaries within and of a community entails exactly that as well. Who gets to be part of the community? Why and how do they become a part? And what do they need to do in order to be accepted? So, In the end, it's a conflict over the authority over what things mean. While not often labeled a cancellation, I've witnessed incidents like this happening again and again and again. The panicked and sometimes borderline obsessive response by creators is a result of losing that authority. They make long explanation posts in order to regain the interpretive authority over what they said or did. There's certainly a self-harm aspect to obsessively reading every negative thing about you, but I think more importantly, it offers a minute sense of control in a situation where the creator has essentially lost that control entirely. Knowing the exact bad thing people say about you can make the whole situation less chaotic and maybe even less anxiety inducing. Because at the very least, you know. What the creator experiences here goes beyond the death of the author. They do not only lose the interpretive authority over their work by publishing, they also lose the authority over their identity as they become seen as enemies of groups they are part of. It's a conflict that extends to the very core of the self, and because of that, is so explosive. During my research for this, I also read a little bit of Fromm's The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, because, sociology only takes you so far. In that work, I came across the claim that people with high self-assertive aggression are less likely to engage in hostile defensiveness. In order to uphold a pseudo-harmony within the group, self-assertive aggression is denied, and the bottled-up tension and aggression is then directed at the ones who deserve it. Those who deserve it either engage in accidental aggression or self-assertive aggression, both of which Fromm calls pseudo-aggression, which is then experienced as real aggression due to the restrictive nature of the community. The hostile response is stylized, experienced, and understood as self-defense. They started it, even though their initial act wasn't real aggression in Fromm's sense. He says, the person with unimpeded self-assertive aggression feels less easily threatened and hence is less readily in a position of having to react with aggression. Now, take this with a huge grain of salt. I do think it's an interesting and worthwhile view on the phenomenon, and I do think there's at least a little bit of truth in it when it comes to harassment, bullying, toxic, or even abusive situations. And because of that, I do believe that it also plays a role in moral panics or cultural politics in general. Ultimately, this is another thing that sets cancel culture apart from real moral panics, or whatever conservatives are on at the moment. Because the people who engage in that behavior are facing real aggression in many circumstances. Defensiveness becomes the norm, not because of a character flaw, but because it can save your ass if you're part of a marginalized group. Marginalized groups face a lot of violence and face a lot of aggression. Even today, I imagine that my tormentors might come back to get me. And you can convince me that fascism, complete with registries, badges of shame, and concentration camps, won't break out at any moment. I can't fault anyone for that. I do believe, though, that a general distrust towards other members of the community is misdirected defensiveness and quite harmful. So I am now in this godforsaken spot where I do struggle to understand it on an emotional level, but on a rational level, I feel like I do understand it, and I kind of understand where it's coming from. So it's just like, yeah, thanks, brain. What am I gonna do with that? Lastly, I'd like to bring up a point that Martha Nussbaum makes about moral panics. If Americans fear sexual degeneracy and the breakup of the family, they fear crime even more. Sex and crime, indeed, are the two focal points of contemporary panic about the subversion of core moral values. And that actually is a sentiment that I see on Euro fandom Twitter a lot, to the point that people refer to it as Americanization of fandom. In that view, American laws and morality become the standard that everyone needs to adhere to. Not only because everyone is automatically assumed to be American, but because these rules are internalized as right and good by the people that propagate them. It is what it is. There's no room for disagreement. That would also explain the excessive and disproportional punishment in the US justice system, and it creates a link between that empirical fact and the supposed exaggerated response to moral failures. The right to kill someone who breaks into your house without any real repercussions is, in that framework, linked to the righteousness and heroism of harassing people for their bad behavior. It's self-defense. They had it coming. They deserved it. Is that true? Well, the fuck do I know? It's not exactly provable, which is exactly what makes all of this so vicious and kinda dumb. Nothing asserted is provable, not the expected slippery slopes, not the nature of this conflict. Whatever the actual real nature of all of this is, I do believe that communities and groups inherently have an oppressive element to them, at least if you follow the understanding of oppression that Iris Marion Young proposes. And I do believe that the only reason why some popular leftists get upset now is because their goals and ideals aligned with the community before. So, I mean, they never experienced it as oppression because their goal and their view and their ideals, they at least thought, are the same as the community they belong to. That was also the case with Habermas. There is no leftist fascism. Something is either fascist or it's not. And even the distinction of conservative or progressive doesn't really apply, because fascism usually combines elements of a mythical past that should be realized in the future. Alienation and exclusion hurt, but there's clearly more to fascism than that, because those are pretty normal operations of a society. And yeah, I don't like it, but I also exclude people all the time in my personal circle. I do see some people as political enemies, and I do see some people as malicious. It's just, we live in a society, folks. However, I do get the feeling that speculating about people's motivations based on just glimpses of something they said or did is becoming very prevalent, and I do wish we would all work on that, like, honestly. And as I've said in the last video, I'm no exclusion to that, right? I'm not a saint. I'm not better than anyone else. But why assume that someone is only saying what they're saying because they're lying or malicious or trying to cause some harm? And yes, I think even douchebags deserve some kind of respect as fellow human beings. That actually does include... No, I'm not gonna say. I mean, just to go completely blank. No, that's not a figure of speech, is it? Just to do some more soul stripping. Whatever. I am admittedly very sensitive to people speculating about people's motivations, or claiming that they're lying, or asserting that they do mean harm, that the harm they cause wasn't just accidental. Because I did grow up in a narc home. But to me, these acts are ultimately at least one vehicle of oppression. It's an injustice. And yes, even if they deserve it, because who am I to decide that? Who am I to decide what someone deserves? Of course, you might say that as long as a system is unjust, you can't strive for kind of the ideal enlightened society, or that it might even be harmful to the cause to try to do it regardless. But I disagree. I don't believe that a just system automatically brings about the ideal person or the ideal camaraderie. Nor do I believe that the ideal person necessarily brings about a just system. I think it's a reciprocal process. I think they influence one another. I just don't buy the idea of enacting cruelty in the name of justice. Because everyone ultimately believes they have good reasons for their cruelty. How can you be sure? Within a sophisticated system, you can't be. And that's exactly the point. In conclusion, am I a perverted deviant who seeks the destruction of society? Yes. But on a real note, I learned a lot from the research I did, but I'm actually conflicted whether it answered any of my questions. I don't think it really did. Ultimately, that's also because society as a system that consists of so many small individual parts is inherently chaotic, right? So there will be no universal answer that is 100% true for every single part. But I hope the things I presented offered at least some other viewpoints. If you're interested in the topic, you can read. I always have my references listed in the description. And most importantly, the most important thing of them all, please don't understand my video as kind of the enlightened answer or anything. I don't have the answer. I just try to give a perspective that I believe could be true, or offer an additional perspective that can maybe broaden someone's view on the topic. But don't believe I speak the absolute truth. I mean, I say what I believe to be true, but I'm not enlightened, right? I'm just a person. I'm not even a good person, let's be honest. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I'm having a good time actually, and yeah, see you soon. I survived as outsiders have always survived, by becoming more a spectator than a participant in the world around me, by developing a contemplative attitude towards events, and by escaping ever more deeply into the world of words, books, ideas. I'll probably be talking about trans rights again. Yay!